I've never been easily scared. I grew up in a small town where everyone knows each other, and my routine has always been quiet. I work as a freelancer, so my life isn't exactly full of excitement. Most of my time is spent at home, in front of my computer. It was just another Thursday, past midnight, and I was wrapping up a project. The night was unusually silent, like the world outside had hit pause. The kind of silence that makes you notice sounds you'd normally ignore. The hum of the monitor, the creak of the wooden floor, and then a knock at the front door. That wasn't normal. My house is in a quiet neighborhood and people around here don't make late-night visits. I thought it was odd but tried to ignore it. Maybe someone had the wrong address, I thought. But the knocking continued, steady and persistent. There was something unsettling about the rhythm. Like whoever was knocking wasn't in a hurry, but also wasn't leaving. I got up from my chair, a mix of curiosity and nerves bubbling up inside me, the faint glow of the monitor casting shadows across the room. I crept to the door, trying not to make a sound, and peered through the peephole. Standing outside was a man in a delivery uniform. He was holding a rectangular package, not too big, with a smile that didn't feel right. I can't explain exactly why, but there was something off about his uniform. The colors were close to a well-known delivery company, but the logo seemed crooked, like someone had tried to mimic it. My heart raced, and adrenaline kicked in. Who delivers packages at this hour? I stood there frozen, hoping he'd leave, but he didn't. He just stood there, motionless, holding the package, like he knew I was watching him. Minutes dragged on, and I could hardly breathe. The porch light cast a dramatic glow on his face, highlighting every line and shadow. The smile didn't fade, but it wasn't friendly either. It was like he was posing for a photo only I could see. Just as I thought he might finally give up, the smile disappeared. He looked directly at the peephole as if he could see me, and took a step closer to the door. My stomach twisted, and I instinctively stepped back. That's when the silence returned, but it was heavier than before. I stood there trying to process what had just happened. Did he know I was there? That didn't make sense. The peephole is subtle, and I hadn't made a sound. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, that maybe it was just a lost delivery driver or a bad prank. But then I heard the strangest sound. It wasn't knocking this time. It was like someone was dragging their fingers across the wood of the door, slow and deliberate, like they wanted to get my attention without making too much noise. The sound sent chills down my spine. I crouched down, staying out of view, and listened. The scraping went on for what felt like forever. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. When the noise finally stopped, I worked up the courage to look through the peephole again, and what I saw made my blood run cold. He wasn't on the porch anymore. The empty space where he'd been standing gave me a fleeting sense of relief, until I noticed the package was still there, but he was gone. A shiver ran through me. Where did he go? And why would he leave the package? It felt like everything was calculated to unnerve me further. I tried to think rationally. I locked all the doors, checked the windows, and even turned off the lights in the living room to feel less exposed. But I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to call the police, but when I picked up my phone, it had no signal. That had never happened before. Panic started to take over. I went to the kitchen to grab a knife, something that might give me a sense of security. It was ridiculous, I knew, but at that moment, anything helped. Then, when I returned to the living room, I almost dropped the knife. He was back, standing in the same spot, holding the package, but now his smile was even wider. This time, he didn't knock. He just stood there, motionless, staring at the door. I hid behind the couch, unable to muster the courage to get closer. I could barely breathe, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why was he doing this? Who was he? And why, as terrifying as it was, did it feel like he wasn't just a man outside, but something different? The hours dragged on and he didn't move, like a statue, with that smile that made me want to scream and run, yet kept me frozen in place. Each minute that passed, my fear morphed into a strange sense of resignation. He was determined to stay there, and I had no idea what he wanted. I looked out of the kitchen window searching for a solution, but the only exit was through the front door. The package was still sitting there, and the porch light flickered intermittently, like something out of a horror movie cliché. I wondered if I should just open the door and end this once and for all. But every time the thought crossed my mind, a primal instinct screamed inside me, "Don't do it." Then something happened that made me question if I was losing my mind. Out of nowhere, he tilted his head to the side, almost like a curious dog, and slowly lifted the hand holding the package, pointing directly at the peephole. It was as if he was saying, "I know you're there. Open up." My whole body shook. It was a simple gesture, but the way he did it was deeply unsettling. It was calculated, almost mechanical. I felt small, like prey backed into a corner. My hands were sweating, and the knife slipped slightly from my grip. Time seemed distorted. I can't say how long exactly he stood there without moving, but suddenly he turned around and began walking down the porch steps without looking back. I thought it was over, that he had finally given up. But when I looked through the peephole again, what I saw made my heart stop. At the end of the driveway, under the dim glow of a street lamp, there were more figures. 3, 4, maybe 5 people, all wearing uniforms identical to his, each holding identical packages. They stood there, still as statues, all facing my house, like they were waiting for something. My mind was on the verge of collapse. I knew I couldn't just sit there. I grabbed my phone and, even without service, dialed 911, hoping it would work. The call didn't go through, but the sound of static filled the line, breaking the oppressive silence. Then I heard footsteps again on the porch. He had come back, but this time he wasn't alone. The sound of their uneven footsteps echoed, and I knew there was more than one person outside. My gut told me that if I opened the door, I wouldn't live to tell what happened. I hid behind the couch, trying to muffle my breathing. Every sound felt amplified. The footsteps on the porch, the rustling of the wind, the distant chirping of a cricket. I waited for the worst, but all that came was an oppressive silence. They stopped knocking, stopped scratching, stopped moving. Whatever they were waiting for me to act first. My hands were trembling as I gripped the knife. I knew staying still wouldn't help, but I couldn't muster the courage to confront them. Then a desperate idea crossed my mind. I could open the bedroom window and slip out along the side of the house without making a sound. I took off my shoes to stay quiet and crept toward the hallway. Every step felt like an eternity, but I finally reached the window. As I slid the glass open carefully, I heard something that made me freeze. A voice outside, low and raspy, said my name. It wasn't a shout or a call. It was like a whisper directly inside my head, something that echoed impossibly within me. My whole body locked up, and for a moment I thought about giving up. But something deep inside, a survival instinct, forced me to keep going. I jumped out of the window and landed on my knees in the damp grass. I looked toward the front of the house and saw the uniforms illuminated by the flickering porch light. They were still there, motionless, like a macabre painting. I don't know how, but I ran as fast as I could without looking back. Each step felt like the air around me grew heavier, as if something invisible was trying to pull me back. When I reached my neighbor's house, I pounded on the door with all my strength. I didn't care if I woke everyone up. I just wanted someone to help me. Finally, the lights inside came on, and Mr. Carson, a man in his 70s, opened the door with a confused expression. I could barely speak, but he understood something was wrong and let me in. I called the police from his house, and this time the call went through. When they arrived, they searched my house but didn't find anyone. The package? Gone. The security cameras I had installed? Disabled. The officers tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just an elaborate prank, but I knew better. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night, but since then, I've never stayed home alone. And every time I hear a knock on the door late at night, my whole body freezes, remembering that endless night when the world stopped making sense. I always thought living alone was the pinnacle of independence. My name is Emily, and this happened in 2017 when I was 29. I had just moved into a rented house on the outskirts of town. It was a simple yet charming place with a cozy living room, a small backyard, and a bedroom upstairs. After years of sharing apartments with roommates, I finally had my own space, a place to call my own, even if temporarily. I worked as an editor, so I spent most of my days at home, making it even more comfortable. But everything changed when strange things started happening. At first, I didn't even notice. It was small, insignificant stuff that seemed easy to brush off. The first thing I realized was the milk in the fridge. I was sure the carton had been full the night before, but in the morning it was half empty. I thought maybe I'd used more than I remembered or that I was getting forgetful. Then it was my keys. I always hung them by the door, but one day I found them on the kitchen counter. I must have left them there, I thought. It was the only logical explanation, right? I lived alone, so who else could move my things? But the small coincidences kept piling up. One time I noticed one of the upstairs windows was unlocked. That was odd because I had a habit of checking all the windows before bed. Another time, a damp towel appeared in the bathroom, even though I hadn't used the shower that day. Still, I found ways to justify it. I'm overworked, distracted, not paying attention, I told myself. It wasn't until I heard the footsteps for the first time that my confidence in being alone began to crumble. It happened in the middle of the night, on a Thursday. I was lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when I heard something. A creak coming from downstairs. My heart leapt, but I forced myself to believe it was just the old wooden house settling. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Soft, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. I froze. There was no denying it. Someone, or something, was moving in the house with me. Summoning all my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs, my hands trembling. When I turned on the lights, there was nothing, just silence and emptiness. I must be imagining things, I whispered to myself, trying to shake off the growing dread. After that night, I started sleeping poorly. Every little noise would jolt me awake, heart pounding. For days, I didn't hear anything else, but the strange changes continued. An apple with a bite taken out of it appeared on the kitchen counter, even though I hated apples. A blanket I never took out of the closet was suddenly folded on the couch. I felt paranoid, but I didn't want to tell anyone. I was afraid they'd laugh or say I was losing my mind. I tried to convince myself that there was a rational explanation for everything. After all, it was an old house. Things like this happen, right? But then, something happened that I couldn't ignore. One afternoon, while cleaning my bedroom, I noticed something odd on the ceiling. There was a faint mark, as if something had been dragged across it. It was such a subtle detail that I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't looked up at that exact moment. As I got closer, I realized the mark led to the attic hatch, which I had never used. It was a simple pull-down ladder built into the ceiling. I knew the house had an attic space, but the landlord had never mentioned it being used. Nervously curious, I decided to take a look. I carefully pulled the ladder down, feeling the wood creak under my touch. The smell of dust and old wood filled the air as I climbed the first few steps. Shining my phone's flashlight around the space, my stomach turned. It wasn't just an empty space like I had imagined. There were things up there. A thin mattress leaned against the wall, empty food wrappers scattered on the floor, a half-full water bottle. And the most unsettling detail, a pair of sneakers, too small to be mine, left near the mattress. I stood there frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. Someone had been living there, above me. I scrambled back down the ladder, my heart racing like a drum. I called the police immediately. When they arrived, they searched the attic, but of course, whoever had been there was long gone. They told me it was common in cases like this for someone to sneak into homes and use them when the resident was asleep or away. The strangest part was that there were no signs of forced entry. It could be someone who had access to the keys before you rented the place, one officer suggested. I had the locks changed that same day, but the fear had already taken root. I couldn't stop thinking about how many nights that person had been up there, hiding while I slept. After changing the locks, I thought things would improve, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I spent days replaying every detail in my mind. Had I crossed paths with that person without realizing it? Had I left any opportunity for them to come back? The thought of someone living above me, watching my every move, was suffocating. I started avoiding being home alone at night. I spent more time at friends' houses or in coffee shops. Even then, the feeling of being watched never left me. I was scared to even look in the mirror, as if I'd see something or someone reflected behind me. One night I came home later than usual. A meeting at work had run long, and by the time I got back, the neighborhood was eerily quiet. When I opened the door, something felt off. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but the air felt heavy, strange. I climbed the stairs slowly, as if something was holding me back. When I reached my bedroom, I noticed that the window overlooking the backyard was unlocked again. But this time, there were footprints in the dust on the floor, leading straight to my closet. My heart nearly stopped. I knew I had locked everything before leaving. I took a deep breath and, in a surge of courage mixed with desperation, flung open the closet door. Nothing. Just my clothes, hanging motionless. But the fear had already won. I called a friend, begging him to come over immediately. While I waited, I sat on the bed, trying to rationalize everything. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe I was getting paranoid because of everything that had happened. That's when I heard it. A faint but unmistakable sound, like something or someone moving very slowly in the attic. I froze, unable to even breathe. My friend arrived not long after, and together, we decided to check the attic again. This time he insisted on bringing a baseball bat while I stayed behind him, clutching the flashlight. When we opened the hatch and climbed up, everything seemed just as it was before, but something caught my eye. The mattress was no longer leaning against the wall. It was laid out as if it had been used, and next to it was a message scrawled on a dirty piece of paper. "I see you." The words were shaky, barely legible, but the intent was clear. This wasn't just someone living there. It was someone who knew exactly who I was. After finding that note, I couldn't deny what was happening anymore. Something was deeply wrong in that house, and I wasn't going to stay to find out what else that person was capable of. I spent the night at my friend's place, and the next morning, I started looking for a new place to live. I didn't know if this was a real threat or just psychological games, but the fear had become unbearable. The police came back to investigate, but they didn't find any more clues about who had been using the attic. As I packed my things, I kept hearing faint noises from above. I didn't have the courage to check again, so I avoided even looking at the attic hatch. On my last day, while the moving truck was being loaded, I decided to take one last walk through the house to make sure I hadn't left anything behind. That's when I saw it. A piece of paper lying on the living room floor. Something that hadn't been there before. On it, in the same shaky handwriting, were the words, "You can leave, but I'll always find you." My blood ran cold. I picked up the paper and showed it to the police, but, as expected, They said there was nothing more they could do other than keep an eye out. I moved into a friend's apartment temporarily, but for months, I couldn't shake the feeling that the person was still watching me. Every time I passed an open window or walked alone at night, I felt like I was being observed. To this day, I don't know who that person was, or how they managed to live in my house undetected for so long. I never heard from them again, but the trauma stayed with me. I still check every closet, every corner, and I've never been able to sleep deeply anywhere since. If there's one thing I've learned from this, it's that true terror isn't what we see in movies or read in books. It's the uncertainty, the constant fear of something unseen but very real lurking nearby. And above all, it's the realization that even in a place that should be the safest in the world, your own home, you're never completely alone. I've never been one to believe in supernatural things. I've always seen myself as a practical guy, someone who blames bad luck or strange coincidences instead of coming up with crazy theories. My name is Ryan, and at the time this happened, I was 32 years old, working as a night operator for a security monitoring company. My shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m., so my life didn't align much with the rest of the world. I was used to the silence of the early hours, empty streets, and the solitude of my small apartment in a quieter part of the city. It all started on a Thursday, or at least that's what it seemed like at first. I got home around 6:30 in the morning, already exhausted, and saw a package sitting by my front door. Nothing unusual, I thought. Occasionally a delivery would arrive while I was working, and the courier would leave it at the door. But something about this package felt off. It was small, wrapped in brown paper with tape so perfectly applied it looked almost surgical. What stood out the most, though, was the label. The address was correct, but there was no sender, no name, no company. Just my name, Ryan, and my address. It made me a little uneasy, but I was too tired to think much about it. I set the package on the kitchen table and headed straight for the shower. Later that afternoon, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the package. I hadn't ordered anything, at least nothing I could remember. Working night shift sometimes put my brain on autopilot, and day-to-day things often slipped through the cracks. Maybe it was something I'd ordered and forgotten about? I decided to open it when I woke up, but I have to admit, for some reason, that package started to bother me. It didn't make sense, but there was something wrong about it. The way it was sealed, the lack of any clues about its origin. Sleep came quickly, but the unease lingered. When I woke up that evening, the package was still there, untouched. I carefully opened it with a kitchen knife. Inside was a small dark wooden box with no markings or decorations, and it was sealed too. The air around me felt heavier, though I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I left the box aside, deciding to deal with it later. Deep down, I think I was avoiding the discomfort it caused me. After all, why was I so nervous about a package that, for all I knew, could be harmless? Little did I know that was just the start of a string of disturbing nights. That night I went to work as usual, trying to ignore the discomfort the wooden box had left me with. My shift was quiet, nothing out of the ordinary. But when I got home, something immediately caught my attention. The package I had left on the kitchen table was now on the floor, as if it had been pushed. For a second I thought maybe I hadn't placed it properly, but I was sure I'd left it in the center of the table. The thought that someone might have entered my apartment crossed my mind, but the door was locked, and none of the windows showed signs of being forced. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The following night, things got even stranger. I was sitting on the couch watching something to try and unwind before bed, when I heard a faint knock at the door. It wasn't a normal knock, though. It was hesitant, like whoever was on the other side couldn't decide whether they wanted to be heard or not. When I looked through the peephole, there was no one there. I opened the door, my stomach twisting in knots, but the hallway was empty. The package was where I had left it, still sealed, but it felt like it was staring back at me, waiting. On the third night, it got worse. I was almost asleep when I heard a clearer noise coming from the living room window. It sounded like a whisper, too faint to make out the words, but loud enough to know it was there. I approached the window slowly, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or my imagination playing tricks on me. But when I looked out, I saw a shadow moving too quickly to make out any details. My heart raced, and even though I didn't fully understand what I had seen, something inside me knew it wasn't normal. That's when I realized something even more unsettling. The package, or rather the wooden box inside, seemed connected to these events. Maybe it was paranoia, but I started to think that whoever had sent it knew exactly when I was home. The knocks, the whispers, even the strange shadow. Everything happened when I was there. I started to wonder if the package had been sent on purpose, not as a gift, but as a tracker. Something to observe me, or maybe even manipulate me somehow. The idea sounded absurd, but in that moment, it made too much sense to ignore. That night, I made a decision. I had to get rid of that box. I didn't care what was inside it or who had sent it anymore. I grabbed the package, still sealed, and drove to an empty lot a few miles from my apartment. The place was isolated, perfect for getting rid of something I never wanted to see again. I buried the box under a thick layer of dirt and drove back home feeling a little lighter, like I had left that burden behind. But deep down, something told me it wasn't going to be that simple. The next morning, after my shift, the relief disappeared completely. As soon as I stepped into my apartment, my heart nearly stopped. The package was back, sitting exactly where I had left it before. It wasn't just similar. It was the same package, with the same perfect seal, and the same label with my name and address. Seeing it there froze me in place. It was like the object was mocking me, laughing at my attempt to escape it. Fear turned into a knot in my stomach, and no matter how much I tried to think of a logical explanation, nothing made sense. I decided to try something different. Instead of trying to get rid of the package, I chose to confront it. I took the wooden box out, sat on the couch, and with trembling hands, broke the seal. Inside, there was a folded piece of paper, handwritten in shaky, uneven letters. The words looked rushed, almost scribbled. "You are being watched. Do not leave your house at night." My entire body went cold. It wasn't just the warning that terrified me. It was the idea that someone had managed to place it there without me noticing. Who had written it? How did they know so much about me? And most importantly, what would happen if I ignored the warning? I wanted to run, to leave everything behind and get out of there, but something told me it wouldn't help. That same night, while I was trying to figure out what to do, the knocking started again. This time it was louder, almost aggressive. I grabbed a baseball bat I kept in my bedroom and went to the door. My breathing was heavy, and my heart was pounding in my ears. When I looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty, but the knocking continued. It was as if something invisible was there, demanding that I open the door. Then, the whispers started again, this time louder, almost forming words I couldn't quite understand. I didn't open the door that night. I backed away to the couch, gripping the baseball bat so tightly my hands went numb. The sounds continued for hours, alternating between knocking and whispering, until just before dawn, when everything suddenly stopped. The silence was so abrupt it made me even more uneasy. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, but I had no idea how to deal with it. I felt trapped, alone, with a package that seemed intent on driving me insane. The next morning, I finally worked up the courage to take the package to a friend of mine, Mark, who worked as a police officer. He was the kind of guy who didn't believe in anything he couldn't explain with logic. When I told him the story, he laughed and said it was probably just some elaborate prank. I asked him to keep the package for a while to see if anything happened, and he agreed, though he made it clear he thought I was overreacting. For the first time in days, I felt like maybe I'd made the right move. But that same night, the worst thing happened. Around 3 in the morning, I was woken up by a call from Mark. His voice was shaky, completely different from his usual confident tone. He said something strange was going on. The package had disappeared from the precinct, and he'd started hearing whispers in his own home. Before I could ask more, the call dropped, and I never heard from him again. The next day, I learned he'd taken a leave of absence and moved to another city without explaining why. The package was never found. After that, everything stopped. The knocking, the whispers, it all vanished as suddenly as it had begun. I don't know if it was because the package was no longer near me, or if it just ended. To this day, I don't have any answers. I'm not even sure I want them. All I know is that sometimes, when I'm home alone, I still get the feeling that something is watching me, waiting. And honestly, that's what scares me the most. You know that feeling when your house is quieter than it should be? It's strange because, at the time, I lived alone and was used to silence. It was 2018, and I had just moved into a house I bought after saving for years. A small, rustic place with that old-time charm. It had a basement I never had the courage to explore properly. The real estate agent said it had been used as a pantry, but to me it was just a cold, damp space with a musty smell and a heavy atmosphere that clung to my skin. I always kept the basement door locked, more out of habit than necessity since I didn't use it for anything. That night I was sitting on the couch watching some random show when I heard a faint noise beneath me. At first I thought I was imagining it. It was such a weak sound, like a creak, but it seemed to come from the basement. I figured it must be the heating system. After all, the house was old, and I'd already heard strange noises from the pipes before. Even so, it bothered me. I got up and went to the basement door, just to check. The lock was still in place, but the state of the door handle made me pause. It looked scratched, like someone had tried to force it open. I tried not to overthink it and went back to the couch, convincing myself it was nothing. In the days that followed, I couldn't sleep well. I'd wake up every morning with a vague sense of unease, like something was off. One morning, as I sat drinking coffee, I decided to open the basement door for the first time in months, just to take a look. It was a typical basement, dusty shelves and old wood, but the light caught my attention. It was on. That was impossible because I clearly remembered turning off the basement breaker when I moved in. Thinking I might have flipped the wrong switch, I turned off the light at the wall and quickly went back upstairs, trying to shake off the growing discomfort in my chest. That same night, I went to bed early but woke up in the middle of the night with a strange sensation, like someone was watching me. It was irrational, I knew that, but the feeling was so intense I stayed frozen for a few seconds before I managed to look around. Everything seemed normal, but when I went to the kitchen for water, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The basement door was slightly open. I was sure I had locked it the day before. At that moment, panic took over me. My first reaction was to go to the door and close it, but as I got closer, I realized something was very wrong. The air felt colder, almost damp, and there was a strange smell I hadn't noticed before. A mix of mildew and something metallic, like rust. I grabbed my phone and used the flashlight to look inside, not daring to step down the stairs. Everything looked normal, but the silence was unnerving, dense, as if the space was waiting for something. I carefully closed the door, locked it again, and shoved a chair against it just to be sure. I tried to go back to sleep, but I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, with that horrible feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, I knew I had to investigate further. I called a friend of mine, Nate, who works as an electrician, and asked him to check the house's system, including the basement. He came over in the afternoon and started inspecting everything. When I asked about the basement light, he seemed puzzled and said the breaker for the basement was indeed turned off, making it impossible for the light to have turned on by itself. He even suggested there might be an issue with the old wiring. But when we went downstairs together, he also noticed the scratches on the door handle and commented that they looked recent. That made me uncomfortable, but I tried to laugh it off nervously, joking that maybe I needed a cat to scare off the mice. That night, everything seemed calm. I was almost convinced I was overthinking it, imagining things. Then, around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly to the sound of something falling to the floor. It was a loud, sharp noise that made me jump out of bed. I grabbed my phone and walked into the hallway, my heart pounding. The chair I had placed against the basement door was lying on the floor. The door was slightly open again. This time, the smell was stronger, almost unbearable. My instincts told me to run, but something inside me forced me to grab the flashlight and look once more. When I shone the light into the doorway, my heart nearly stopped. On the middle of the stairs, there was something that looked like a piece of fabric, maybe an old shirt, but it was dirty and torn. It hadn't been there before, I was sure of it. The basement light, which I had turned off earlier, was on again. My chest tightened, and it felt like each heartbeat was harder than the last. I ran back upstairs, locked the door, and shoved a heavy dresser in front of it. This time, I wasn't willing to ignore what was happening. The next morning, I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I called the police and explained that I thought someone might have broken into my house. 2 officers arrived quickly, asked a lot of questions, and went down to the basement to investigate. I stayed at the top of the stairs, my hands sweating and my heart racing. After a few minutes, one of them came back up and said there was nothing down there except the dusty shelves and the piece of fabric I had mentioned. He said it was probably just trash left by the previous owners. But the way he spoke, avoiding eye contact, made me suspicious. It felt like he wanted to close the case too quickly. Even so, I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia. I had an important meeting at work that day, so for the first time in weeks, I left the house, feeling a strange mix of relief and anxiety. I spent the whole day trying to focus on other things, but my mind kept going back to the basement. When I returned home in the late afternoon, I found the front door locked, just as I had left it, but something felt off. As soon as I stepped inside, I noticed the house was freezing cold, as if all the windows had been left open. That strange smell was back, stronger than ever. I knew I had to face it, but the fear was almost paralyzing. I decided that this would be the last time I went into the basement. I grabbed a kitchen knife and my flashlight, trying to summon every bit of courage I had. I walked down the stairs slowly, feeling each step creak beneath me. When I reached the bottom, everything looked normal, until I noticed something that made me freeze. One of the shelves was slightly pulled away from the wall, revealing the outline of a hidden door. It wasn't obvious, but with the flashlight I could see the edges and a small, rusty handle. My breathing became heavier, and for a moment I thought about turning around and pretending I had never seen it. But it was too late. I had to know what was going on. With trembling hands, I pulled the handle and opened the door. Inside, I found a small space, almost like an improvised room. There was an old mattress on the floor, empty food wrappers scattered around, and the most terrifying thing, a series of photos pinned to the walls. They were pictures of me. Some were old, taken in places I barely remembered, but others were recent, taken inside my house. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine and nearly dropped the flashlight. I ran upstairs, locked the door, and called the police again, barely able to explain what I had just seen. I was 16 at the time, and it was just another Friday night. My parents had gone out for dinner with some friends, leaving me home alone. We lived in a typical suburban neighborhood where nothing exciting ever happened. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved to each other, and you could hear the crickets chirping at night. I was on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, eating popcorn, and watching one of those cheesy horror movies that made me laugh more than they scared me. Around 10 p.m., I paused the movie to grab a soda from the kitchen. And that's when I noticed something odd. From the kitchen window I could see the street, which was almost deserted. But there was a car parked a little way down, near a streetlight that wasn't working. It wasn't a car I recognized. It was small, black, and old-looking, with its headlights off. I thought it was strange, but I didn't give it much thought. Maybe someone was waiting for a friend or had pulled over to take a phone call. I grabbed my soda and went back to the couch, trying not to think too much about it. But about 30 minutes later, as the movie played on, I couldn't shake this nagging feeling. It was like someone was watching me. Curiosity got the best of me, and I went back to the living room window to check. The car was still there, but it looked like it had moved closer to my house. My heart started beating a little faster. I thought I must have been imagining things. Maybe I just hadn't noticed how close it was before. Still, the idea of a car creeping closer made me uneasy. I told myself it was just paranoia, a side effect of watching horror movies alone. I tried to brush it off and focus on the movie, but the unease wouldn't go away. It felt like the night was heavier somehow, like something was off. After a while, I couldn't resist checking again. I went upstairs to my bedroom window for a better view. And when I looked out, my stomach dropped. The car was now parked right in front of my house, under the shadows of the trees lining the street. I ducked down instinctively, my heart racing so hard I could feel it in my throat. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was out there, getting closer and closer, almost like they were playing a twisted game. I grabbed my phone and punched in 911, but I hesitated to call. What if I was overreacting? What if it was just someone innocently parked outside? I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was all in my head, but something inside me insisted I needed to check again. Carefully, I opened a small gap in the living room curtain, just enough to peek outside. The car was no longer in front of my house. Relief washed over me for a split second, until I noticed it again. This time it was parked in my driveway. My chest tightened, and it felt like the air in the room had turned thick. My hands were trembling, and my stomach was in knots. Whoever was in that car was now just outside my door. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I picked up my phone and called the police, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. The dispatcher asked me to stay on the line, but before I could say much more, I heard a faint noise outside. It sounded like someone scratching at the front doorknob. My entire body froze. I knew I should move, but the fear rooted me in place. Still holding my phone, I dashed into the kitchen and grabbed the sharpest knife I could find. I wasn't sure if it was to defend myself or just to feel less helpless. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. I cautiously crept back to the living room, keeping a safe distance from the windows. The street was quiet, but the car, it was gone again. I ran to the door and checked the lock. Then, outside, I heard the faint screech of tires, as if someone was speeding away. I hurried back to the window and peeked out, but there was nothing. It was as if the car had vanished into thin air. My eyes scanned the area frantically for any sign, any movement, but everything was still. The only thing left was the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. Minutes later, the police arrived. I went outside to meet them and explained everything that had happened. They searched the area but didn't find anything unusual. I stood outside while they investigated, the cool night air biting at my skin. One of the officers called me over as they shone their flashlights on my driveway. That's when I saw it. Tire marks, right where the car had been. It was the only proof that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. The officer suggested it might have been someone playing a prank or a would-be intruder, but they couldn't be sure. They promised to send patrols through the area for the next few nights. After the police left, the house felt emptier than ever. I closed all the windows, double-checked the locks on the doors, and turned off the lights. I went to my room, but I couldn't bring myself to lie down. I sat on the edge of my bed, gripping my phone tightly with trembling hands, staring at the door like something might burst through at any moment. I tried to convince myself I was safe, but the memory of that car in my driveway wouldn't leave me. Who was it? Why were they doing this? And, most terrifying of all, would they come back? Around midnight I finally lay down, though I was still on high alert for any sounds. I don't know how much time passed, but I woke up to a loud noise, a sharp creaking sound, like wood being pushed under strain. My heart started pounding again. I stayed completely still, holding my breath, listening. The sound was coming from downstairs like footsteps on the living room floor. Instinctively, I grabbed the knife I had left by my bed. Every step I took toward the staircase felt heavier, weighed down by the adrenaline coursing through me. When I reached the top of the stairs, the house was pitch black, except for the faint glow of a streetlight outside. I looked down but couldn't see anything at first. I stood there, frozen, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the dark. That's when I noticed it. The front door was slightly open. My heart stopped. I was absolutely sure I had locked it. I descended slowly, my throat dry and my hands slick with sweat, straining to hear anything. Footsteps, whispers, any sign of movement. But the silence was deafening. When I got to the door, I nudged it open carefully and peeked outside. The street was completely deserted. It was like the world had paused in that moment. But then I looked at the driveway, and my blood ran cold. The tire marks were back, deeper this time, as if the car had returned. But I hadn't heard any engine, no sign of movement. It was as though it had arrived silently. A shiver ran down my spine, and for the first time, I began to wonder if this was something I could even explain rationally.